please get your food, and we are going to start in a very few minutes. Welcome, everyone, to another session of our Schemel lunch series. Before I introduce the introducer of this young man that I know, I'd like to remind you that the church and state people will be meeting on Wednesday night back in the library, and so don't forget that. It's in 305 this time again, because there's a reception upstairs to which you're all invited. But now that we're all here and mostly seated, I'm going to turn the podium over to Bill Rao, a good friend of ours, a good friend of our speakers, and he will give you a more objective introduction than I would. Maybe. Bill Rao.
Thank you and welcome, everybody. It's my privilege to welcome David Meyers to this venue, a friend for since 1995 when we cooperated on a conference here, which evolved into a shared publication project, which included some remarks about the history of the Jewish community in the Scranton area. David comes to us from Philadelphia, where he's spending a year away from his duties at UCLA as a member of the History Department and Director of Judaic Studies program. And he is at the Center for Advanced Studies, Judaic Studies, in Philadelphia. He just described it to me as the Garden of Eden of my field. So he's happy to be back doing research, although he's traveling quite a bit and managing that well at this early stage in the year. Is it a year-long arrangement, David? So this is great because you'll be back visiting with us. I won't say very much about what you're going to be discussing because that is your work, but I'm very eager to hear you discuss a theme from your recent book, Between Jew and Arab, The Lost Voice of Simon Ravidovich. And it's a very important contribution, an interesting story. And speaking of stories, the title of your remarks, The Tale of Two Stories, of Two Narratives, The Tale of Two Stories. Well, David, welcome. It's so good to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. It really is a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come in the middle of the day. I'd like to thank again Bill, my dear friend, for his warm remarks and greetings. And I'd, of course, like to thank my parents for allowing me to be here in the most profound of ways. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be back at the University of Scranton. I spent a very formative year here, my freshman year of college, where I was introduced to the ways of the Jesuits, to the writerly and rhetorical arts that the Jesuits have refined over the course of their 500-year history. And I have a great deal of admiration and appreciation for the Jesuitical tradition, the Jesuitical intellectual tradition. And yet I'm also mindful of the fact that over the course of that that half millennium, that 500-year history of the Jesuits, there have been instances of excess of missionary zeal, excess of colonial imposition, excess of misguided faith. It may well be on that last point, and only that last point, that I would find common cause with Bishop Martino. But I make this point not to bring discredit or dishonor to our hosts, because, as I said, I do have great appreciation and admiration for the Jesuits and their extraordinary achievements, but to point out the complexities of history, the Janus-faced quality of history, the multifaceted nature of history, which seems to me no more evident than in the century-long conflict between Jews and Arabs over that piece of territory known alternately as Palestine, Eretz Israel, Israel, and a host of other names. As you may have gathered from my pointing to the multifaceted nature of history, I am particularly struck by the presence not merely of multiple narratives about that piece of territory, but the existence of multiple truths. The truth claims of the two major combatants, the Jews and Arabs, the Palestinians and Israelis, strike me as both valid and worthy of our consideration. This is a perspective that, alas, is very infrequently advanced. It strikes me that one of the optical illusions that the intensity of the conflict generates is the perspective that one side is possessed of good, virtue, and justice, and the other is possessed of evil. One side is the source of light and harmony, and the other is primarily, if not solely, responsible for the conflict. That is not a perspective that I would like to advance today. As I said, I'm very much struck by the multiplicity of truths, not just of the narratives that each side tells, but of the truths contained within the narrative. And they're, at some level, remarkably parallel, except they move in opposite directions, which is to say that the Jewish story of the relationship to what Jews call the land of Israel is a story of the movement from exile to homeland. The Arab or Palestinian story is parallel in many regards, except it moves in reverse. It is a story of the movement from homeland to exile. And it strikes me that one of the features that might serve to ameliorate the conflict, that might serve to bridge the chasm between the two sides, is sorely lacking. And that is the capacity to engage in a kind of introspection and self-reflection that can permit an appreciation and understanding of the humanity of the other side. That's a theme that I would like to touch upon at the end of my remarks, that very quality that has been so infrequently present in the conflict, that capacity for self-reckoning that is the necessary condition, the prerequisite to an appreciation of the humanity of the other. But before we get there, I would like to do two things. First, I would like to discuss with you what I see as some of the key myths that prevent an understanding of the multiple truths at work in the conflict between Jews and Arabs over Palestine/Israel. And then second, I would like to discuss what I see as a possible solution to this century-long conflict, while also raising some very serious structural obstacles. And then I will conclude with a few very brief remarks about the importance of introspection, of reflexivity, of self-reflection. So let's move directly to the myths. The first myth that I would like to discuss is the myth that the land known historically as Palestine was a land without a people intended for a people without a land. That was the formulation attributed to any number of early Zionist thinkers from the late 19th century up through the 1920s. It's particularly associated with one important Zionist leader by the name of Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of the State of Israel. And it's premised on the notion that when the first Zionist settlers began to move to Palestine in the mid-1880s, they were encountering a land devoid of discernible population. This particular piece of mythology dug deep roots in Zionist consciousness, and yet it was confounded by two very key bodies of source material. First, the actual census data on Palestine, which made quite clear that Palestine was not devoid of an actual discernible population, of human settlement. We know from a variety of census sources, including Ottoman census sources, and demographic analyses of Jewish sociologists, and most particularly a very prominent late 19th century Jewish sociologist by the name of Arthur Rupin, that there were between 400 and 600,000 Arab, Muslim or Christian residents of Palestine, that piece of territory that extends from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. In that same period, talking about 1890-95, there were approximately 25 to 40,000 Jewish residents of the Holy Land, of Palestine, who constituted what was known as the Old Yishuv, the Old Jewish Settlement. We also know of the presence of a very sizable Arab population from a number of important Zionist thinkers who made their way from Europe to Palestine in the 1890s and the first 2 decades of the 20th century and report on what they find, which is very large concentrations of Arabs, especially in rural areas and in a number of cities, including Haifa and Jaffa. So this set of evidence suggests to us that the claim recently advanced, and I mean recently, by recently I mean over the last couple of decades, recent revisionist claims that in fact the Jewish settlers operating under the aegis of the Zionist movement, a movement of national liberation devoted to the reclamation of the ancestral homeland of the Jews. These recent revisionist claims seek to wipe the map of Palestine of Palestinian Arabs. And this is simply a patently false claim and has virtually no historical foundation, and yet is repeatedly made in the name of legitimizing the Jewish assertion of a link to the land of Israel. So this is myth number one, that Palestine was essentially devoid of human content prior to the advent of the Zionist settlement project. A second myth that I'd like to discuss is the myth that Zionism was a movement of foreign colonialism which lacked all legal legitimacy. That should be subdivided into 2 claims. First, Zionism as a colonial movement, and second, the question of the legal legitimacy of the Zionist movement. It is indeed true that when the first Zionist settlers came to Palestine, and they came to Palestine primarily because of a push, not a pull. The push was out of European society because they faced increasing tides of anti-Semitic expression and deed. When they came to Palestine, they did not come as the representatives of any colonial power. On the contrary, they came to escape the oppressive or threatening conditions that they faced in Europe. It is the fact that when they arrived in Palestine, the Zionist settlers established a colonization office for the purpose of purchasing land. Indeed, it was an important Zionist aim to purchase land and, in some measure, gain territorial control over that land through the legal purchase of land, largely from absentee landlords known as effendi, who often lived in the more prominent centers of settlement in the Ottoman Empire in Beirut or Damascus. So there was a very serious project undertaken by the Zionist organization, later known as the World Zionist Organization, to purchase land, to cultivate it, and through that, both to allow for the rehabilitation of the Jewish national body through actual physical labor, and to allow for Zionists to gain a measure of control over the land of Israel. I think it's a mistake to claim that Zionists came to Palestine with the intention of subjugating or introducing a kind of civilizing mission upon the local population. We can accuse the Zionist organization of a good number of things, but I think that intention is not one of them. We can accuse the Zionist organization of a kind of blindness to the presence of this large native population. And there was a measure of colonization, but it was not a colonization that entailed the imposition of a kind of cultural agenda upon that native population. So Zionists do not come as the colonial agents of any European power, although European powers in this very period, in the first decades of the 20th century, are very interested in asserting control over the Middle East. The French and the British in particular divide by the middle of the second decade of the 20th century the Middle East into their respective spheres of influence. But the Jews are not the direct representatives of either, or for that matter, of any European power. Now I want to talk about the legal legitimacy of the Zionist claim to Palestine, because some have suggested that, in fact, the Zionist hold is a very tenuous one and lacks any reasonable measure of international legitimacy. One of the things that the Zionist movement sought to do, alongside its colonization of the land, alongside the agricultural labor that was deemed to be therapeutic for a Jewish national body, these are the terms used by the Zionists themselves, that had, in a sense, laid fallow for centuries in the diaspora. What it sought to do alongside this project of agricultural labor was to sway international opinion to the Zionist side. So in the first decade or so of the 20th century, efforts were made to sway, respectively, German, French, British, and Ottoman authorities to recognize the legitimacy of the Zionist claim. These efforts really reached a peak in the year 1917. On November 2nd, 1917, the new power that wrested control of Palestine from the decaying and declining Ottoman Empire, namely the British, issued what was known as the Balfour Declaration, which recognized that Palestine was and should be the national home for the Jewish people. This is a very significant development in the diplomatic machinations of the Zionist movement to gain the favor of His Majesty's government in 1917, precisely at the moment when the British gained actual physical control of Palestine. This, by the way, this formulation, a national home for the Jewish people, did not mean a Jewish state. It meant that Jews' historical claim to settlement in Palestine was recognized. But that was quite a distance away from recognition of the right to a Jewish state. And in fact, we notice that in this period, 1917 through the 1920s, Zionists of the main labor Zionist movement, the leading branch associated with the person who became the first prime minister in Israel, David Ben-Gurion, did not speak openly of a state. They spoke of creating a national society and didn't yet raise the ante to talk about a state, because that was deemed to be too forward with the new British hosts. But what we do see during the period between 1917 and, say, 1930, a very concerted, deliberate effort by the Zionist movement to build national institutions that would be transformed into institutions of state. And in fact, when we make our way to the mid-1930s, the discussion does begin to shift from the creation of a national society to the creation of the state. And we see that even reflected not only in the rhetoric of Zionist leaders, but also in the language of the British hosts, who from 1922 forward were granted what was known as a mandate to govern Palestine, a mandate granted by the newly created League of Nations. In the mid-1930s, in the wake of the ongoing strife and enmity between Jews and Arabs on the ground in Palestine, the British sent a commission of inquiry to investigate the matter, known as the Peel Commission. And the Peel Commission interviewed a wide range of activists and officials on both sides in 1936 and 37, and then issued its recommendation that Palestine be partitioned into a Jewish and an Arab state, an idea which the Jewish side accepted, probably for tactical reasons more than principled reasons, and the Arab side rejected. But that already begins to establish a pattern that will recur. What is important for us is that the Peel Commission's recommendations, which were pulled off the table by 1938, constituted yet another step in the international legitimation of the Zionist cause. And that's how it was understood by Zionists. But probably this most significant piece of international legitimation of the Zionist cause came a decade later, in 1947, on November 29th, when the newly created United Nations General Assembly, in Resolution 181, announced its plan to end the British mandate over Palestine through the creation of two states, reprising, in a sense, the logic of the Peel Commission, but adding the full force of the international community. The international community, by the way, which included in the 33 votes in favor of partition both the United States and its major rival at the time, the Soviet Union. Again, the Jewish side accepted Resolution 181. The Arab side rejected 181. This leads us to a third myth. Let me just repeat the logic of the second myth, that the Zionist effort lacked international legitimation altogether. From Balfour to Resolution 181, there were a series of international steps that recognized the legitimacy of the Zionist claim to Palestine. After the resolution is issued, almost immediately after the resolution is issued, on November 29th, 1947, the local Arab population commences a military assault upon the Zionist side. And that leads to a third myth that I would like to discuss. And that myth is that the conflict of 1948, the defining conflict really of Jews and Arabs in Palestine, all that preceded it, the enmity, the hostility, the violence, was really a preface to the major conflagration of 1948. It's been a long entrenched myth in many circles that that conflict was a conflict in which David faced Goliath, in which the Jewish side, beleaguered and small, faced a massive Arab army, Arab Sea. And this claim has been subjected to very careful scrutiny over the last 2 decades or so, primarily by a cohort of scholars in Israel, or Israeli in origin, known as the New Historians, who have suggested that, in fact, number one, there was not a qualitative advantage to the Arab side in the conflict, but quite to the contrary, a very significant qualitative advantage in terms of materiel and training for the Jewish side. Number two, contrary to widespread assumptions, contrary to the fact that in the second stage of the conflict after the first phase was the attack by local Arab forces in Palestine against the Jewish forces. In the second phase, on May 15th, 1948, 5 Arab armies invaded the newly proclaimed State of Israel. Notwithstanding that, there actually was not a quantitative advantage to the Arab side either, because when one undertakes a careful analysis of the respective military forces, one sees that the Jewish side was able to mobilize virtually every qualified, able man and woman to the task of war, and they possessed a degree of training that allowed a much larger, not a much larger, a larger number of skilled military personnel to assume the battle than the Arab side, with 5 armies and the local Arab High Command were able to mount. So this is yet another component of the myth of David versus Goliath. A third component of it that has been challenged, scrutinized, and to a certain extent disabused is that the British decisively tipped their hand to the Arab side in 1947 and 1948, and there's lots of evidence, especially that assembled by one historian in particular, an Israeli writing at Oxford, Avi Shleim, to suggest that this isn't true either. But perhaps the most significant sub-myth of the larger myth of David versus Goliath with respect to the 1948 war is the claim that tens or hundreds of thousands of local Palestinians left Palestine in the midst of the hostilities of their own volition. We now know rather clearly and I think across the scholarly spectrum that Jewish and later Israeli forces, I say Jewish because until May 14th, 1948, there was no State of Israel. So Jewish and then after May 14th, Israeli forces engaged in forced expulsions of tens and more likely hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs. Not all Palestinian Arabs were expelled, but we know that hundreds of towns and villages were not just forcibly expelled, but then razed to the ground. Some 450 to 500 villages were razed to the ground, and a substantial portion of them were forcibly emptied of their inhabitants. Now, we know this in part because of the work, in large part because of the work of these new Israeli historians, and the most prominent among them is an historian by the name of Benny Morris, whose 1988 book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, resulted from a massive archival study of largely Jewish sources, which speak explicitly about not only the order to expel, but the actual action of expulsion. Morris was attacked mercilessly in Israel for what was seen as a traitorous act, upending one of the foundation myths of the State of Israel, namely that it was created in a spirit of justice. That, in fact, what happened is the local Palestinian population took flight, confident that it would be restored to Palestine on the heels of a decisive Arab victory. The story is much more complicated than that. Morris was mercilessly attacked in the late 80s and 90s after the collapse of the Oslo peace process, which I'll say a word about in a minute. He changed very dramatically his whole worldview and acknowledging that expulsions took place, went on to justify them as a necessity of war. And his famous image is that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. You can't create a state without this kind of act of violence at the outset. What this revisionist take of the claim of David versus Goliath pushes to the fore is the extraordinary significance of 1948 in our understanding of the competing narratives and the competing truths over Palestine. 1948 is understood by Jews and Israelis as the year of independence, as the year of liberation. In Hebrew, 1948 is known as the War of Liberation, the War of Independence. Both terms are used. Milchemet ha'atzmaut, Milchemet ha'shichur. On the Palestinian side, 1948 is known by the Arabic term Nakba, the catastrophe. And it's at this point that you see that these two narratives, these two stories of national groups contesting for the same land, begin to move in dramatically opposing directions. This might lead us to a fourth myth, and often does, namely that the Palestinians lack all agency. They lack all capacity to shape their own future. And here I would say that notwithstanding the very significant dispossession that occurred in 1948, still it is not accurate to say that the Palestinians lacked or lack agency. They possessed agency in their efforts to organize, both politically and militarily, from the 1920s up to 1948. And after about a decade period of reeling in a state of trauma, they organized themselves again in 1964 into the Palestine Liberation Organization, an organization that committed itself to a path of armed resistance, and particularly after 1967 to terrorist acts against civilians. Attack that was adopted for about 2 decades until it was formally renounced. Throughout the history of Palestinians in the 20th century, I think we can say that at various points in time, they possessed very considerable agency, very considerable capacity to shape events. And yet, one of the tragedies of Palestinian history is the legacy of absolutely abysmal leadership. A point acknowledged openly by Palestinian historians, and most significantly, I'd mentioned the Palestinian-American historian Rashid Khalidi at Columbia University, whose book Iron Cage really lays out quite clearly the series of abysmal leaders that the Palestinians were set with. A companion of this myth that Palestinians have lacked all agency is the claim that the Israelis have no partners. This is a claim that has been heard. There's a kind of continuous rhetorical line that we can draw from the 1920s to the present. We have no partner. And this is a claim that I find as false as the claim that the Palestinians lack all agency. In the sort of balancing act that is the power relations between Palestinians and Israelis, between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, it is certainly the case that the balance of power has tipped to the Jewish-Israeli side, and certainly after 1948 in decisive fashion. It isn't true that Palestinians lacked all agency, but nor is it true that the Israelis did not have a partner. In fact, part of the responsibility of political power and part of the art of diplomacy is the capacity to enfranchise and create a partner. Moreover, at various points in the period from 1948 on, in fact, Palestinian and Arab leaders have been willing to engage in negotiation with the Israeli side, which has not met their entreaties with great receptivity. It's also the case that, as we perhaps know well, for much of that history, what we've heard publicly out of the Arab side is the language of rejectionism. And yet part of what I'm trying to do is to complicate the story a bit by asserting that Israel could and should have done more to create its own partner for peace, not by repeating the mantra that there is no partner, but by working behind the scenes to actually build up a responsible, mature political party on the other side with whom it could engage in negotiation. And this leads me to the final myth that I'd like to discuss, which is the myth that there is no exit. There is no solution. It would seem so beset are the two sides by their various mythic representations of themselves and the others, so deeply entrenched in their own sense of virtue and self-victimization that a solution is impossible. Well, here's the irony. The solution is actually well known to almost all sides. It's the solution that was hammered out in that fateful decade, the 1990s, which began with secret negotiations that took place in Scandinavia between Israelis and Palestinians, which then brought into the public eye Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, and that were associated with the name Oslo. The Oslo negotiations, which commenced in 1992 and really came to an end in early 2001, offered up a template for a workable solution that entailed the following components. First, Israeli withdrawal from 94 to 97% of the territories it occupied after 1967 in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Second, the division of Jerusalem. That is to say, Jerusalem would become the capital not just of Israel, but of the new Palestinian state. Third, resolution of perhaps the thorniest and longest standing problem in the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, that is the question of the refugees. It's estimated that in 1948, anywhere between 700,000 to 850,000 Palestinians fled or were displaced from their land in Palestine. The United Nations in December 1948 issued Resolution 194 that called for the repatriation of those refugees who were prepared to return to their homes and live in peace with their neighbors, or compensation to be paid to those refugees should they choose not to return to their homes. At present, it would seem, and indeed this was the logic of Oslo, that repatriation of now 4 million Palestinians to the state of Israel, to their erstwhile homes, would not be a workable solution, would be both impractical and politically impossible, certainly from the Israeli side, which means that the other clause of UN General Assembly Resolution 194 has to be invoked, and that is the clause which calls for a compensation. And indeed, in the Oslo peace process, there were very explicit discussions about the extent of compensation to be provided for refugees and their descendants, along with the promise of a token repatriation of some 50,000 Palestinians to Israel proper, and the full right of return of Palestinians to the newly created state of Israel, the newly created state of Palestine. So the right of return would be exercised not in Israel, but in Palestine. This would entail historic compromises. People would not be returning to their homes, or the homes of their parents, but they would be returning to a sovereign state of their own. It is said that agreement was reached almost to the last item, including Israeli acknowledgement of partial responsibility for the dispossession of Palestinian refugees in 1948. And yet, the deal hammered out by Israeli and Palestinian officials was not signed off by Yasser Arafat. I don't mean to place the entire blame for the collapse of the Oslo process on the Palestinian side. There were lots of things at the Israeli side that made it very difficult. But I do think that it was a mistake of epic proportions on the Palestinian side. And in fact, part of that long history of unfortunate and ill-guided leadership. That template still exists. That model solution still is on the table, but I fear that it may no longer be retrievable. And that's for two reasons. One, because the aftermath of Oslo revealed that at the end of the day, the Palestinians may simply not be able to countenance the existence of Jews in their land. And second, and maybe even more significantly, it may be that the Israeli project of settlement building that commenced after the 1967 war, that was pursued by every government regardless of ideological coloration, that settlement project may make a two-state solution impossible, because extricating 50,000 to 100,000 settlers, those who would not be swapped back to Israel as part of a peace agreement, those who would either be remain where they were or be forcibly removed. Either of those prospects strikes me as highly unlikely. And in this regard, it may be that the Israeli project of settlement building, which was understood as part and parcel of the ethos of that pioneering spirit to reclaim the land, may prove the very death knell of the one solution that can assure the continuation of a Jewish state. Because if Israel is not able to extricate itself from the West Bank, if it is not able to pull up the most ideologically committed settlers, then it will essentially be in control of the entire terrain from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and either can grant all individuals in that territory rights of citizenship, in which case they would very likely vote a Jewish state out of existence, or it can maintain a two-tiered system, two regimes of legal status for Jews and Arabs, which in other contexts went by the name apartheid. I find myself in a state of considerable pessimism about the future because of these two structural obstacles to a plan that both sides know well. And yet, my hope rests largely with the fluidity of events in the Middle East and in Palestine in particular. I never believed that there would be a moment when Israelis and Palestinians were sitting together discussing the most intricate, tricky, and involved matters, and were arriving at considerable agreement. So based on that principle, perhaps there is hope. But if there is to be change, it absolutely requires, not as a sufficient condition, but as a necessary condition, the kind of introspection and self-reflection that I mentioned at the beginning. It's the kind of introspection and self-reflection that the main protagonist of the book that Bill Rao mentioned, Simon Ravidovich, possessed in the early 1950s. Simon Ravidovich was a Jewish thinker, part of the founding faculty of Brandeis University, who believed that after 1948 it had become a moral and political imperative of Israel and the Jewish people to address equitably the Arab question. And for him, that meant two things. It meant an end to statutory discrimination against Arabs who lived in the newly created state of Israel. And it meant, provocatively, the repatriation of Palestinian refugees to the newly created state of Israel. Now, as I've suggested, the latter offer or proposition strikes me as unworkable in today's world. But what I would like to hold on to from Ravidovich is this capacity for self-reflection, introspection, and self-reckoning that allowed one to see the humanity of the other. There were fascinating glimmers of this in the Oslo peace process, and I'd like to mention just one example. The efforts of an Israeli and a Palestinian scholar, Dan Baron and Sami Adwan, to produce a shared textbook, Israeli and Palestinian textbook. Not to blend the two into one, but to stand the two side by side so that children could understand there is another perspective out there in the world. This represents the kind of self-reckoning introspection that I'm speaking of. Ultimately, what I think is necessary, and I certainly can't promise success, is transcending history precisely by confronting history, by extending beyond oneself to engage in a critical inquiry into the least appealing, embarrassing, shameful episodes in one's own past in order to recognize the virtue of another's. Thank you very much for your attention.